The two old men lived in a small village where life moved slowly and faith was woven into everyday breath. Their names were Yepham and Elisha. Both were respected by the villagers for their simple lives, honest work, and deep belief in God. Every Sunday they stood quietly in church, their wrinkled hands folded, their eyes lowered in humility. They did not speak much, but when they did, their words carried the calm weight of long experience. For many years, one dream lived in their hearts: to go on a holy pilgrimage to Jerusalem, the sacred place they had prayed toward all their lives. They talked about this dream often, especially in the evenings when the sun dipped behind the fields and the air grew cool. Yepham would sigh and say that a man should see the Holy Land before he died. Elisha would nod slowly, his eyes shining with hope. They were not rich, but they began saving little by little. A coin set aside, a meal skipped, a small comfort refused. Years passed, and at last, they had enough. The day they left the village, neighbors gathered to see them off. Some admired their courage, others worried they were too old for such a journey. But the two men felt strong in spirit. They believed God would guide them. With walking sticks in their hands and prayer on their lips, they set out toward the distant land. The journey was long and difficult. They crossed rivers, climbed hills, and walked under burning sun. At night they slept wherever they could, sometimes under open skies, sometimes in poor shelters offered by kind strangers. Their bodies grew tired, but their hearts were full. They prayed together every morning and evening, thanking God for each step. One evening, after many days of travel, they reached a large river that had to be crossed by boat. The crossing was dangerous, and the boat was small and crowded. As they stepped inside, Elisha lost his balance. He fell hard and injured his leg. A sharp cry escaped his lips, and his face turned pale with pain. When they reached the other side, Elisha could barely stand. Yepham helped his friend sit down. Elisha tried to rise, but his leg would not carry him. Tears filled his eyes, not only from pain but from fear. He knew the journey ahead was still long. With a heavy voice, he told Yepham to go on without him. "You must not give up your pilgrimage because of me," he said. "I will rest here and pray. God sees the heart." Yepham was torn. He had dreamed of Jerusalem all his life. He had sacrificed so much to reach this point. Yet before him sat his old friend, helpless and in pain. After a long silence, Yepham made his decision. He knelt beside Elisha and said, "How can I go to pray in a holy place and leave my brother suffering on the road? If I abandon you, my prayers will be empty." He stayed. He found a small shelter near the river and cared for Elisha. He washed his swollen leg, searched for herbs, and begged food from passers-by. Days turned into weeks. Slowly, Elisha's leg healed, but by then it was clear they could not continue the journey. Their money was gone, and their strength was fading. With heavy hearts, they decided to return home. The walk back felt longer than before. The joy they once carried was replaced by quiet disappointment. Sometimes Yepham wondered if he had failed God by not completing the pilgrimage. Sometimes Elisha felt guilty, believing he had ruined his friend's dream. Yet neither spoke these thoughts aloud. They continued to pray, asking God to forgive their weakness. When they finally reached their village, people were surprised. Some whispered that the old men had failed. Others shook their heads, saying the journey was too much for them. Yepham and Elisha said nothing. They returned to their simple lives, working, praying, and helping others as they always had. One Sunday, a few weeks later, something strange happened in church. During the service, the priest paused and looked troubled. After the prayers, he told the villagers of a vision he had received. He said that two old men from their village had been seen praying in Jerusalem, and their prayer had risen straight to heaven, brighter than gold. A murmur spread through the church. Everyone knew Yepham and Elisha had never reached Jerusalem. The priest called them forward. With trembling voices, the two men told the truth of their journey, of the injury, and of their return. The priest listened carefully. Then his face softened, and tears filled his eyes. He said, "Brothers and sisters, understand this. God does not measure faith by distance walked or rituals completed. He looks into the heart." These two men reached Jerusalem not with their feet, but with their love, sacrifice, and mercy. When one gave up his greatest dream to care for the other, their prayer became pure. Silence filled the church. The villagers felt shame for their judgments and awe at the lesson before them. Yepham and Elisha stood quietly, their heads bowed. They did not feel proud. They felt only peace. From that day on, the story of the two old men spread beyond the village. People spoke of it as a reminder that true devotion is not found in holy places alone, but in kindness, compassion, and selfless love. And the two old men continued their lives just as before, content in the knowledge that the path of faith is not always the road we plan to walk, but the one love asks us to take. The second old man's story began where the first journey ended, in the quiet realization that faith is tested not in grand moments but in small, everyday choices. After returning to their village, Yepham and Elisha continued their simple routines, yet something deep within them had changed. The dream of reaching Jerusalem no longer burned with the same restless desire. Instead, a calmer understanding settled in their hearts, like still water after a storm. Elisha's leg healed slowly, but his spirit healed faster. During the long weeks of rest, he had spent hours in silent prayer, not asking for miracles, but for patience and gratitude. He reflected on the moment he had fallen by the river and how quickly hope had turned into fear. Yet, in that moment of weakness, he had witnessed a greater miracle, his friend choosing compassion over ambition. That memory stayed with him like a gentle light. Yepham, too, carried new thoughts. At night, when the village slept, he often sat by the window, looking at the stars. He wondered why God had allowed their journey to end so abruptly. Slowly, the answer formed in his heart. Perhaps the purpose of the pilgrimage was not to reach a holy land, but to reveal what truly mattered. This thought did not come as a sudden revelation, but as a quiet truth that grew stronger each day. One morning, news spread that a severe drought had struck nearby villages. Crops failed, wells dried up, and many families were left hungry. Travelers passing through spoke of children crying for bread and old people collapsing from exhaustion. The villagers listened with concern but also with fear. They themselves had little to spare. Yepham and Elisha looked at each other. Without speaking, they understood. What they could not complete with their feet, they would complete with their hands and hearts. They gathered what little food they had stored, sold a few personal belongings, and prepared to travel again, not to Jerusalem, but to the suffering villages. The road this time felt different. There was no excitement, no dream of holy sights ahead. Yet there was no doubt either. Each step felt purposeful. When their legs grew tired, they rested. When hunger came, they shared what remained. Along the way, they met others traveling for trade or safety, and the old men offered comfort and prayers instead of advice. When they reached the first village, the sight broke their hearts. Dry earth stretched like cracked skin beneath the sun. Houses stood silent, and faces were thin with worry. The two old men did not announce themselves or explain their purpose. They simply began to help. They distributed food, drew water where it could still be found, and sat beside the sick, listening to their stories. Elisha discovered that his old injury, though mostly healed, reminded him of his weakness. It slowed him down, but it also made him gentler. He understood pain more deeply now. When he prayed with the suffering, his words were few, but his presence spoke louder than long sermons. Yepham worked from dawn until dusk, his hands rough and aching. At times, doubt returned. He wondered if such small efforts could make any real difference. But then he would see a child smile while eating a simple meal, or an exhausted mother whisper a blessing, and his doubts would fade. As days passed, the villagers began to notice the quiet strength of the two old men. They did not preach or judge. They did not claim wisdom. They listened. They served. Slowly, hope returned to places where despair had settled. One evening, as the sun set in deep red colors, a young man approached them. He had lost his faith during the drought, believing God had abandoned them. He asked the old men why they still believed after facing disappointment themselves. Elisha looked at Yepham, then answered softly. He said faith is not believing that life will be easy, but trusting that love still has meaning when life is hard. That night, the two old men prayed together under the open sky. There were no grand words, no requests for reward. They simply thanked God for allowing them to serve. In that moment, both felt a peace deeper than anything they had imagined in Jerusalem. When the drought finally eased and relief arrived, Yepham and Elisha quietly returned home. They were older, weaker in body, but stronger in spirit. Their faces carried a calm joy that others could feel without explanation. Years later, when both men had passed away, the villagers remembered them not as pilgrims who failed to reach a holy city, but as souls who understood holiness itself. Parents told their children the story of the two old men who learned that true devotion lives in sacrifice, kindness, and compassion. And so, their second journey became greater than the first. Without ever seeing Jerusalem, they had walked a path that led straight into the hearts of others. In serving the suffering, they had touched something eternal. Their lives whispered a simple truth that remained long after they were gone. The truest prayer is not spoken in words or measured in miles, but lived through love.